The British monarchy changed its name to survive a war. In 1917, amid the thunder of the First World War, a German dynastic label, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, became a national liability. Shells fell across Europe, and anti-German sentiment echoed through Britain's streets and Parliament alike. To endure, the royal house shed its foreign-sounding skin and took refuge in stone and symbol. Windsor, a fortress on the Thames, became its new identity and shield. The transformation was swift but seismic, accomplished by a single order in council, signed by King George V, recasting centuries of lineage with one stroke of the pen. From that moment, the Windsors would weather war, abdication, scandal, and reinvention, royalty remade through necessity and narrative. Why that name, that year, that mechanism? And what, in the act of erasure, was lost? Heritage, honesty, or merely a name too heavy to bear in battle? They met as cousins in the web of Europe's princely houses, but their union did more than tie two families together. In 1840, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a small but well-connected German duchy. That match plugged the British crown into a network already binding courts from Brussels to St. Petersburg. It also installed a disciplined, reform-minded partner at the center of British power. Through Albert, the dynasty absorbed new habits, method, efficiency, and a confidence in science, traits that would steer the crown through the industrial century. Their marriage doubled as a signal about Europe's royal culture. Sovereigns didn't just rule, they married strategically. Over the next decades, Victoria and Albert's children and grandchildren married into ruling families across the continent. By the fin de siècle, Victoria had sons, daughters, and grandsons on or near the thrones of Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Spain, and beyond. Couriers and telegrams zipped between palaces carrying gossip and policy hints alike. The press coined a nickname that stuck, the Grandmother of Europe, a nod to how her family tree threaded through the power map. Albert's stamp shows up wherever the crown looked modern. He championed technical education, museum building, and civil service professionalism. He pushed for art and design schools to raise the quality of British manufacturing. He felt that monarchy should set a moral tone as well as promote practical knowledge. That blend, public virtue and technological confidence, became shorthand for the era that took their names. His largest stage came in 1851. The Great Exhibition turned Hyde Park into a global trade fair inside the Crystal Palace, a vast structure of iron and glass. Exhibitors brought steam engines, precision tools, textiles, and every kind of gadget from across the empire and the world. Crowds filed past displays that claimed Britain led the modern age. The building itself, prefabricated and luminous, advertised engineering as public spectacle. For the crown, it framed innovation as a national value endorsed at the very top. At home, Victoria and Albert curated a different kind of message. Portraits and prints showed a close-knit household, children tumbling around a piano, a sovereign and consort attentive to family routines. These images softened the aura of distant majesty. They met a public hungry for stability and propriety in a fast-changing economy. The domestic script was not accidental. It insulated the throne by aligning it with middle-class ideals. Then, in 1861, Albert died at 42. Victoria's grief was profound and prolonged. She wore black, retreated from many public duties, and governed through paperwork and intermediaries. Crowds that once cheered grew restless as visibility shrank, and politicians had to balance respect for mourning with pressure for presence. Yet the seclusion built a different legend, the Widow of Windsor, a figure of endurance whose sorrow seemed to mirror a nation burdened by responsibility. Through all this, their German roots raised few eyebrows. Britain admired German scholarship, music, and organization. The two countries exchanged tourists, teachers, and style. The names Saxe-Coburg and Gotha sounded continental rather than suspect. There was a hidden cost in the bloodlines spread so widely. A mutation for hemophilia passed through Victoria's descendants and surfaced in royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia. In Russia, the Tsarevich's illness amplified the influence of mystics and courtiers around a fragile court, adding strain to a regime already under pressure. By late century's end, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha sat at the center of Europe's palace network. That prominence would soon clash with a new age of flags, mass politics, and sharper borders. She took the throne in 1837 at 18, stepping into a court burdened by years of scandal and public cynicism. Her uncles, the sons of George III, had left a tangle of debts, mistresses, and political friction. The institution looked shaky. The new queen brought discipline to routine and clarity to process. She met red boxes daily, learned the limits of royal influence, and threaded herself into the rhythm of cabinet government. That steadiness began to rebuild prestige at the top, while Britain's streets and factories roared into a new age. Her reign lent its name to a period defined by relentless industrial acceleration and a growing empire. Railways stitched the country together, steamships shortened oceans, industrial towns swelled as coal and iron fueled mills and foundries. Alongside expansion overseas, a strict public ethic took hold: sobriety, thrift, duty, and respectability. These weren't abstract slogans. They shaped schoolrooms, workhouses, and parish halls. The crown, through patronage and presence, linked order at home with power abroad. Victoria turned into a national symbol of stability and domestic virtue. Marriage and child-rearing became public assets as much as private roles, reinforcing a sense that respectable family life underpinned national strength. This image traveled with Britain's flag across continents. Maps shaded in red signaled a reach so wide that commentators said the sun never set on British domains. Naval bases guarded sea lanes, trading companies built networks of credit and commodities, and London's financial markets priced risk for half the planet. Yet the age carried a sharp duality. Grandeur lived next door to hardship. New wealth produced palaces and public buildings, while slums grew in the shadows of factories. Child labor kept costs down. Cities struggled with sewage and disease before modern sanitation caught up. Reformers pushed for factory acts, public health boards, and education. The monarchy endorsed philanthropy and institutional reform, helping to frame progress as a moral duty rather than a mere profit engine. Key to Victoria's political education were her prime ministers. Lord Melbourne guided the young queen through early pitfalls, instructing her in ceremony and restraint. Decades later, Benjamin Disraeli proved adept at linking monarchy to imperial pride, encouraging a role that projected dignity across the empire. Under his influence, she adopted the title Empress of India in 1876. a calculated move that wrapped sovereignty in the language of global rule and bound crown prestige to the subcontinent's administration. Britain's power peaked on her watch. The Royal Navy enforced open trade and deterred rivals. Telegraph cables carried orders and prices between capitals in minutes. Ports from Gibraltar to Singapore marked supply points for ships moving troops and goods. That system of logistics, finance, and law wrapped around the monarchy's public presence, turning statecraft into daily routine. Victorian values outlived the century. Duty, family, morality, and empire set expectations for behavior in public office and for royal conduct long after her death. One technology made that legacy unusually visible. Photography became mainstream during her reign, making her the first monarch whose life unfolded widely in images. Studio portraits, commemorative prints, and family scenes circulated as early tools of image management, giving the crown a repeatable, recognizable face. The century closed with her health fading and her son waiting. Edward VII would inherit global dominance, the weight of restraint, and a public standard set by a mother whose name had become an age. Victoria's death in 1901 closed a long chapter and opened the Edwardian Age, a span that looked polished on the surface and restless underneath. The court traded strictness for sociability, and London moved to a different tempo. Clubs, dinners, and international visitors framed diplomacy as conversation rather than sermon. Technology quickened daily life. Motor cars rattled past horse-drawn cabs. Telephones and wireless sets entered offices and ships. Cinema reels carried news and novelty into neighborhood halls. Reform debates gathered pace, from education to welfare, while the empire's reach filled the docks with grain, tea, and cotton. Confidence felt high, yet strain showed in labor disputes, Irish politics, and a Europe knitting together rival alliances. Edward VII, after decades as heir, finally took the stage. He read the moment well. He preferred ease to severity and made the crown accessible through travel and tact. Courtiers and diplomats noted how he built rapport at home and abroad, smoothing frictions with personal attention. State visits to Paris and other capitals helped thaw old resentments and gave him a reputation for calming tempers between great powers. That charm did not come at the expense of state business. He backed expert advice, maintained discipline and ceremony, and kept the monarchy visible in a modern, urban country that judged institutions by their relevance. His years marked Britain at a high point of wealth and global power. The Navy guarded trade routes, and London markets set prices that rippled across continents. But the home front already showed churn. The liberal landslide of 1906 led to social legislation on meals for schoolchildren, workplace injuries, and pensions for the elderly. The Parliament crisis of 1910 to 11 reshaped the balance between the Lords and the Commons. Suffrage campaigns pressed harder, and strikes tested how far prosperity extended beyond boardrooms. The image of effortless supremacy masked the system trying to adapt to mass politics. Behind the scenes, the dynasty carried a foreign surname that spoke to its 19th century origins. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha came through Prince Albert's line, a reminder of German principalities and the marriage alliances that once glued Europe's royal map. The name reflected real kinship links that still mattered. Edward's son, George, who became George V in 1910, counted among his close relations the rulers of Germany and Russia. He knew them not as headlines, but as family. George V brought a different tone, less sparkle, more steadiness. He prized duty, routine, and a clear line between private life and public service. He made time for investitures, inspections, and regional visits that fed a sense of national inclusion. His reign began amid constitutional repair and ended up grappling with approaching war. As Europe polarized into blocs, those immediate family ties turned awkward. Photographs from family gatherings suddenly sat beside dispatches about naval races and border plans. The closeness that once promised stability now risks suspicion. One scene captured the old world's density of crowns. Edward VII's funeral in 1910 assembled 9 reigning kings, a parade of uniforms and sashes that looked like a continent in harmony. It was also the last snapshot before alliances and mobilization orders split cousins into enemies. Within a few years, newspapers that once praised continental culture printed casualty lists and called out anything that sounded foreign at the top. The surname that had seemed harmless would soon sound like a problem, and the throne would have to act fast to stay ahead of the war's anger. War in August 1914 pulled Britain into a conflict against Germany and its allies, and a century of royal intermarriage suddenly looked like a trap. Royal families' German roots, once a diplomatic asset, became a public liability. The surnames Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, inherited through Prince Albert, sat uncomfortably on a wartime throne. King George V, a naval-minded, dutiful monarch, now found that family trees mattered less than flags. His cousin in Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, led the enemy. The kingship that had stitched Europe's courts together now fueled suspicion at home. George faced a mood that hardened by the week. Newspapers filled with casualty lists and reports of Zeppelin raids. Citizens read stories of spies and saboteurs. Shops with German names saw their windows smashed. Bakers renamed their breads. Businesses scrubbed consonants off signs to sound safer. Even pet dogs were not spared. A dachshund on a London street could draw jeers as if its breed carried a passport. Local councils debated removing German street names. Employers asked staff with German surnames to prove loyalty or leave. The atmosphere did not leave much room for nuance. The monarchy's connection to German relatives turned into a communications crisis. George V and Queen Mary lived restrained, public-spirited lives, but the old name worked against them. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was not a footnote. It was in every court circular and official reference. The problem sharpened when the word Gotha gained a second meaning. A German aircraft, a Gotha bomber, raided Britain from 1917, and headlines linked devastation to a term that also labeled the royal house. The overlap was poisonous. A neutral fact became an accusation by association. Government messaging amplified the divide. Propaganda painted Germany as cruel and uncivilized, a necessary fame for total war. In that climate, dynastic links looked like driftwood from another era. George V understood the stakes, and his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, put options to paper. They studied how to strip German styles and titles, and they weighed how a new name might anchor the crown to a national story rather than a continental family tree. The risks ran beyond embarrassment. In a war that demanded sacrifice, any hint of divided allegiance could drain public trust. Rumor pressed hardest. During the war's middle years, some papers and pamphlets accused the royal household of hidden sympathy for Germany. The claims spread wide enough that the king ordered staff to find and remove German insignia, medals, and monograms from royal residences and burn or store them out of sight. Ceremonial details that once celebrated kinship became liabilities to be erased. The purge extended to stationery, liveries, and even inscriptions on gifts. The debate inside the palace reached a larger question. What does Britishness mean for a monarchy with European bloodlines? For centuries, royal legitimacy leaned on shared dynastic culture across borders. Total war severed that logic. The crown needed to embody national identity in a sharper way: language, names, symbols, and service that read as unmistakably British. Acting slowly risked the sense that the institution lagged behind the people it sought to represent. By mid-1917, the choice had been clarified: keep the old name and fight a rearguard action against rumor, or change the name and signal a clean break. George V chose the second path. The next step would harness a precise legal tool and a word rooted in England's landscape, a pivot meant to make the dynasty sound like the country it led. July 1917. With war pressure at home and on the front, George V made a decisive move. He issued a ruling that renounced his family's German styles and titles and adopted a new dynastic identity: the House of Windsor. The act reached beyond a surname switch. It cut the visible cords tying the crown to continental princely networks and anchored it in a national story. The king aimed to quiet doubts about loyalty by making the monarchy's label sound like the country it served. In a conflict driven by mass mobilization and morale, symbols mattered, and this one worked on contact. The new name carried deliberate weight. Windsor linked the dynasty to Windsor Castle, a residence embedded in England's landscape and political memory. Long before gunfire in Flanders, its walls had faced civil wars, restorations, and the slow growth of parliamentary rule. The selection broadcast continuity and endurance while sidestepping any hint of foreignness. A castle that outlasted sieges now lent its credibility to a family whose legitimacy depended on public confidence. The crown traded a German composite for an English place name that people knew from coins, postcards, and rail excursions. The change required more than a headline. George V ordered relatives domiciled in Britain to anglicize surnames and lay down foreign princely titles. Family branches shifted identities within weeks. The Tecks became Cambridges. The Battenbergs translated their name and reset their status. Court circulars, regimental lists, and official directories removed German descriptors and replaced them with British equivalents. This administrative sweep signaled that the rebrand covered every layer, from the sovereign's house to cousins who attended garden parties and served in uniform. One story captured the plan's reach. Prince Louis of Battenberg, veteran naval leader who had resigned under pressure in 1914, re-emerged as Louis Mountbatten. That step seeded a line that later threaded through Prince Philip and his descendants, binding Mountbatten to Windsor in a way that blended service and symbolism. The adjustment restored a reputation damaged by suspicion and showed how a family could translate loyalty into the language of names. Public reaction validated the calculation. Newspapers and civic leaders treated the move as a patriotic correction, a resetting of the monarchy's compass toward the home front. The court emphasized duty, visits to hospitals, and war work to reinforce the message. As the change filtered through proclamations and the London Gazette, it also spread outside royal circles. Shops, pubs, and even dog breeders embraced patriotic renamings. German shepherds became Alsatians on kennel rolls. Bakeries swapped Berlin buns for Windsor buns. Manufacturers purged German-language marks from catalogs. The ripple effect turned the royal decision into a cultural habit. By recasting identity through a familiar landmark, the crown recaptured trust at a time when rumor and grief could have thinned support. The dynasty no longer read as a European subset. It presented itself as a national institution with deep roots and a practical sense of public tone. The method, change the optics, back it with conduct, became the monarchy's survival kit for the 20th century. It surfaced later in broadcast speeches, adapted ceremonies, and a tighter focus on service that matched public moods. With the new house established, the war would end, but peace would bring fresh tests, politics, economics, and personal scrutiny that would probe how resilient a rebranded crown could be. Victory in 1918 arrived with empty chairs at kitchen tables, inflation, and demobilization lines. The monarchy, now called Windsor, had to earn its place in a Britain that felt older and poorer. George V kept uniforms and wreaths close at hand, attending memorial unveilings and hospital wards while ministers argued over housing and jobs. He used visibility as a tool, ending ceremonies that looked extravagant, pushing courtiers to simplify events, and aligning the court calendar with national commemorations. The pageantry remained, but it moved with a quieter step, and the sovereign's presence leaned toward duty over display. He went where prestige alone would not carry him: factory floors, shipyards on the Tyne and Clyde, pits in coal country, and rail depots became regular stops. Speeches were brief. Handshakes mattered more. Photographs showed the king in bowler hat and overcoat rather than tiara-lit balls. That program helped shift the crown's image from aristocratic distance to a shared civic role. The tours also offered a feedback loop. Ministers and palace staff gathered impressions about wages, strikes, and prices, letting the court read the country in person, not only on paper. The post-war map had redrawn the royal world. Thrones fell in Berlin, Vienna, and elsewhere. Britain kept its crown, but the franchise widened at home. Women over 30 gained the vote in 1918, later equalized, and millions of new voters expected responsiveness from institutions. Mass media cut new channels. Newsreels carried royal events into local cinemas. Cheap newspapers chased readership with headlines, photos, and human interest angles. The Windsors became familiar faces beyond official portraits, a shift that carried opportunity and risk. The 1920s put optimism in shop windows and jazz in dance halls. Motorcars multiplied, hems shortened, and wireless sets hummed in front rooms. George V held to formality and routine, but the younger royals sampled the decade's pace. Overseas tours drew huge crowds, an empire-era blend of spectacle and soft power. The prince most in demand was Edward, the Prince of Wales. He learned to wave from open cars, master posed informality for cameras, and make speeches that landed well with veterans and youth leagues. His appeal ran far beyond Britain, making him a recognizable figure from Canada to India. At home, Edward's private life agitated courtiers. Friendships with socialites and late nights advertised a modern independence that clashed with expectations for restraint. In contrast, his brother Albert married, kept schedules, and wrestled with a stammer that turned every public speaking duty into a test. He worked with coaches, drilled his breathing, and measured each line. The contrast set a pattern: charisma on one side, steadiness on the other, that would soon matter. Technology tightened the link between palace and public. In 1922, Princess Mary's wedding reached listeners by radio, a first. Crowds still lined the streets, but millions more shared the event through loudspeakers in halls and pubs. The medium would soon carry royal messages into homes, collapsing the distance that had once shielded private life. Tabloid culture advanced. Foreign papers reported rumors that British editors held back, and those stories slipped across borders by mail and gossip. Photographers tested boundaries, and courtiers learned that stage-managed images needed constant renewal. Inside the palace, alarms rang about Edward's choices and pace. George V, reading his heir with a father's eye, warned that trouble would follow. The decade looked bright, the economy flickered, and the crown stayed upright. But the next chapter would force choice over charisma when duty and desire collided. January 1936 opened with the death of King George V, ending a calm, dutiful reign and exposing the crown to a fast, uncertain era. The mourning period barely settled before his eldest son moved at a new speed. Edward VIII, already a global celebrity as the Prince of Wales, stepped into kingship fluent in radio, camera poses, and the rhythm of mass audiences. He shook hands on factory lines, cut ribbons without pageantry, and spoke in ways that sounded conversational rather than ceremonial. To many, that felt like modern leadership. To officials, it hinted at trouble. Edward treated convention as an option. He interfered in policy rhetoric, offered opinions on unemployment, housing, and pressured ministers with public comments that looked like political signals. The monarchy's constitutional role assumes neutrality. Edward's style blurred that line. Courtiers tried to modulate his schedule and screen engagements, but he preferred spontaneity. The press at home kept a cautious distance, following norms that discouraged personal scrutiny of a reigning sovereign. Foreign papers did not share that restraint, and the gap between British headlines and international gossip widened each week. At the center stood Wallis Simpson, an American socialite moving in transatlantic circles. She was in the process of divorcing her second husband while maintaining ties to high society in London. The relationship with the king set off alarms across government and church. The sovereign is the supreme governor of the Church of England, and the church did not permit a remarriage in church from a divorced person with a living former spouse. Beyond theology, the civil framework tied the crown to ministers who must answer to Parliament. A royal marriage is not a private act. It requires political assent and public confidence. As the relationship deepened, Edward indicated he intended to marry. That stance activated a constitutional crisis because the government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, made clear it could not support such a union. The Dominions signaled similar views. Without ministerial backing, the king could not pursue marriage and remain within constitutional boundaries. Proposals for a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would be a consort without queenly status, failed to gain traction. Each option ran into the same wall: legitimacy of the institution versus the personal path of the sovereign. Security services tracked the situation closely. Wallis drew attention for her network and continental contacts. During the height of the controversy, MI5 monitored her communications and movements, concerned about political leverage and potential foreign influence on the king. The surveillance underscored how far the state regarded the matter as one of national stability, not gossip. Inside the palace, divisions grew between those who thought the relationship could be managed and those who believed only a complete separation would preserve the settlement built around the constitutional monarchy. Pressure converged in late 1936. Baldwin held firm in meetings, stating the cabinet would not advise in favor of the marriage and would resign rather than carry its responsibility under those terms. The choice was stark: step away from the relationship or step off the throne. Edward would not relent. On December 11th, he broadcast to the nation and the empire his decision to abdicate. The next day, he left as Duke of Windsor and sailed to a life outside the duties he had inherited. His brother, Albert, a reserved man who had wrestled with public speaking, became George VI. The crown entered a more restrained phase, defined by duty over display, with silence where opinion had once led. He arrived at the throne by accident, not ambition. Albert, Duke of York, became King George VI because his brother stepped down, and the task landed on a man who preferred routine, family, and the Navy's order to public spotlight. The abdication left a vacuum. He filled it with steadiness, but it took effort. He carried a severe stammer that turned every microphone into a test. In a monarchy built on ceremony and speeches, his voice became the place where duty met anxiety, and he worked at it daily because he knew the office required clarity. He did not face it alone. His wife, Elizabeth, supplied ballast. She set an even tone at engagements and at home, and she treated the crown's strain as a practical problem to be handled piece by piece. Together, they rebuilt confidence inside the household, closed ranks among advisors, and set a schedule that favored service over spectacle. Her calm made space for him to practice, fail quietly, and try again, which mattered more than the public could see. The couple projected normalcy without pretending ease. That mix suited a country still wary from the previous year's upheaval. Help also came from a therapist outside the usual court circle. Lionel Logue, an Australian speech specialist, worked with the king in sessions that blended mechanics and nerve. Breathing drills, pacing, rhythm, and confidence exercises taught the body to support the words. The process did not erase the stammer, but it reframed it. Speeches became achievable goals rather than hazards to avoid. The partnership showed how the crown could use private expertise to meet a public duty, and it yielded broadcasts that sounded confident enough to steady listeners when events darkened. War arrived and defined everything that followed. George VI's style, quiet, predictable, restrained, fit a nation mobilizing for a long fight. He signed messages to the services, visited training grounds, and listened more than he spoke. The Queen accompanied him to shelters and hospitals, setting a pattern of appearing where morale needed a nudge. They stayed in London through air raids. Even after bombs damaged Buckingham Palace, they refused evacuation, keeping the court in the capital as a signal that leadership would share the risk. Crowds outside the gates read that choice as solidarity rather than symbolism. The couple's movements mapped the city's wounds. They walked blasted streets in the East End, shook hands with shopkeepers sweeping glass, and met families sorting through rubble. Factory tours emphasized effort on the home front, and barracks visits linked the crown to units rotating to the front lines. The king's clipped speeches, delivered at key moments, carried themes of duty, endurance, and unity. They were short by design and precise in tone, reinforcing an image of a people's king who stood where ordinary citizens stood and did not ask for exceptions. One line from those days has become shorthand for their stance. When told of the damage at the palace, Queen Elizabeth said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel we can look the East End in the face." The sentence matched the public's mood and fixed the monarchy inside the city's shared experience. Trust that had wobbled after the abdication settled into something sturdier. The strain lingered after victory. Years of wartime travel, constant cigarettes, and the weight of responsibility eroded his health. He worked at the post-war transition, but his body failed early in 1952. His death opened the path for his daughter, Elizabeth, to step into a role shaped by war service, broadcast discipline, and a nation that now expected the crown to sound like steady ground. February 1952 began with black-edged telegrams and a flight home. King George VI had died overnight at Sandringham. His 25-year-old daughter was thousands of miles away on a Commonwealth tour in Kenya. By the time her plane touched down in London, she returned as Queen Elizabeth II. The detail that defined the moment was stark. She learned of her father's death while staying in a lodge among thorn trees and highland mist, a sovereign maid in transit, crowned first by circumstance rather than ceremony. That origin suited a monarch whose duties would stretch across continents rather than remain confined to court walls. The tone shifted quickly from private grief to state routine. Accession councils, proclamations, oaths, and signatures set the legal frame, while the public saw a young woman step into a role most associated with age and endurance. Commentators began to speak of a new Elizabethan age. Post-war Britain still rationed some goods, yet television sets flickered in shop windows, jet engines rewrote distances, and a younger generation looked for signs that tradition could adapt to a faster world. The crown needed to mark continuity and signal renewal at the same time. That balance took shape in 1953. The coronation delivered pageantry rooted in medieval rites, but executed with mid-century technology. For the first time, a British coronation went live on television, pulling roughly 27 million viewers into living rooms and village halls. Families clustered around small screens and shared sets on street corners, hearing choirs and fanfares while watching a ritual once limited to those inside Westminster Abbey. Cameras, lighting rigs, and cables threaded through ancient stone to turn national ceremony into a broadcast event. The crown had entered the age of mass media by letting the country see the moment it renewed itself. The empire's map also changed its labels. The early years of Elizabeth's reign coincided with a shift from imperial rule to a looser association, the Commonwealth of Nations. Visits emphasized partnership rather than command. Speeches leaned on service, cooperation, and shared institutions, courts, universities, parliaments, rather than imperial hierarchy. The message was practical. A global role would now draw legitimacy from ties chosen, not imposed. At the center of the household Prince Philip pressed for modernization. A naval officer by training, he pushed for efficiency in palace administration, championed technical education, and supported programs that brought young people into science and engineering. His impatience with slow processes clashed with courtiers who protected long-standing protocol, but the friction often produced useful adjustments. Schedules tightened, staff structures changed, and public engagements started to emphasize work, industry, and research alongside clarity. One broadcast fact stands out from those days. The 1953 coronation was filmed in Technicolor and quietly relayed beyond Britain, reaching an estimated worldwide audience in the tens of millions. That distribution made Elizabeth the first monarch whose crowning was experienced globally in near real time, turning ritual into an international signal of continuity. Through it, her demeanor held steady, composed in public, measured in speech, and precise in gesture. After years of war and the grind of post-war austerity, that steadiness mattered. It reassured a society managing loss, rebuilding cities, and recalibrating its place in the world. Yet pressures were already forming at the edges. Television's appetite for access, politics of decolonization, and shifting social norms. Those forces would test how far a young queen's calm could carry an ancient institution into a restless century. The years after the coronation felt like a turn in national rhythm. Britain still spoke with the voice of an old empire, but the soundtrack changed to skiffle, then rock and roll. Television sets spread from shop windows to front rooms, and youth culture pressed against habits that had stood since Victoria. The monarchy moved inside that shift. It had to look steady without looking stuck. The Queen kept the calendar full, investitures, regimental visits, garden parties, while the country debated nuclear weapons, immigration, urban redevelopment, and the future of colonies that were moving toward independence. Elizabeth navigated modernization by adjusting the optics and the machinery. Palace staff slimmed some formalities and opened others to view. Film crews received controlled access to rituals that had been private, while core ceremonies kept their form. Trooping the color and state opening stayed strict on drill and dress, yet camera angles widened and commentary demystified the choreography. The sovereign's overseas trips grew more frequent, and schedules favored schools, factories, and scientific institutes alongside cathedrals and parades. The message balanced continuity with participation. The crown was present in everyday life, not only at balcony moments. Global media transformed the Windsors from distant symbols into recurring characters. Newsreels narrated tours, glossy magazines ran spreads on engagements and family milestones. The palace learned to anticipate the lens, timelines, vantage points, and captions planned in advance so the public saw a clear story. That preparation fed into a landmark broadcast in 1957 when Elizabeth delivered a Christmas message on television as a reigning monarch, drawing tens of millions and turning a royal tradition into an annual domestic ritual shared across living rooms. Prince Philip pushed the institution toward the future with practical schemes and brisk expectations. He cared about efficiency, engineering, and education. He linked royal patronage to those fields. The Duke of Edinburgh's award, launched for young people, set goals in service, skills, physical activity, and expeditions. Schools and youth groups adopted the framework because it was simple, scalable, and measurable. Elsewhere, He urged staff to adopt modern office practices, backed science museums and industry exhibitions, and treated new technology, from jet travel to broadcast formats, as tools the crown should master, not fear. Inside the household, the arrival of Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward gave the public a new generational reference. Family photographs and carefully managed appearances showed a domestic side that echoed earlier royal imagery, but lived in a faster media cycle. The children attended engagements suited to their ages and schooling, hinting that service would be a norm rather than an exception. Their presence also highlighted the gap between post-war childhood and the rules that had governed royal upbringings a generation earlier. The wider map forced a larger adjustment. Britain's power receded after the Suez Crisis in 1956, a reminder that military action no longer guaranteed diplomatic success. Across Africa and Asia, decolonization accelerated. Elizabeth's role shifted toward partnership within the Commonwealth. Tours in 1957 and 1963 emphasized shared institutions, trade, sport, and education. Crowds were large, the schedules relentless, and the language careful. Respect, cooperation, and mutual benefit, replacing imperial vocabulary. By the close of the 1960s, jet travel, youth movements, and pop culture had recast public life. The monarchy learned to hold attention by being available and legible, not commanding. That approach, show the work, just the frame, keep the ritual, kept the institution in step with a country changing at speed. The 1970s opened with a softer focus on family and a harder edge in public life. Inflation, power cuts, and industrial action unsettled daily routines, and class lines blurred under new expectations. Inside that climate, the Windsors leaned on an accessible rhythm, more walkabouts, more regional visits, and a schedule that put the Queen in front of crowds beyond the usual ceremonial set pieces. The household tone turned practical. Engagements centered on hospitals, universities, and factories where workers faced rising costs and uncertain jobs. The cameras followed, and the monarchy learned to meet them halfway. Elizabeth's role as a national adhesive grew. When strikes darkened streets or headlines turned sour, her appearances brought a reset. The aim was modest and consistent. Acknowledge strain, keep language even, and let ritual act as civic glue. At the same time, a new generation stepped forward. The public began to see the heirs not simply as names on a family tree, but as working royals building profiles in real time. That shift mattered because the audience had widened. Television had turned state events into shared domestic moments. Now, it did the same with personalities. Princess Anne signaled the change first. Her 1973 wedding to Captain Mark Phillips drew global coverage and revived the appetite for royal romance without the guilt of an earlier age. The match married equestrian discipline to duty, and the ceremony's reach confirmed that broadcast media could carry a palace milestone far beyond the mall. Anne's schedule stayed brisk after the wedding, with charity patronage and sport lending her a grounded image that fit the decade's directness. Alongside her, Charles increased his pace and range. He completed studies, trained with the forces, and began to speak with care about architecture, heritage, and the natural world. Solo tours exposed him to crowded walkabouts and tough questions from students and local groups. He tested how far he could shape a voice while remaining within constitutional boundaries. The outlines of a future king, curious, structured, and sometimes earnest, came into view. Media strategy adjusted to match. The 1969 documentary, Royal Family, had already opened the curtain, showing barbecues, ordinary breakfasts, and unvarnished moments. In the 1970s, the palace didn't repeat the experiment at full volume, but it kept the lesson. Controlled visibility built familiarity. Sporting crowds, charity galas, and civic commemorations offered set pieces where the royals looked recognizably human while staying formal enough to protect the role. Not every image sat comfortably. Princess Margaret remained a tabloid constant. Nightclubs, holidays, and strained relationships fed a market newly hungry for candid shots. Her presence sketched the edge where glamour met scrutiny and underscored how fame could complicate duty. That tension reminded the household that access created appetite, and appetite did not always respect boundaries. Mid-decade, the map turned to celebration. Silver Jubilee planning gathered committees, routes, and concerts for 1977. The anniversary promised street parties, river pageants, and Commonwealth tours that balanced nostalgia with a contemporary beat. The program aimed to honor continuity while accepting that the country had changed. New music, new demographics, and a press that moved faster than any royal train. One detail from these years stood out. Anne rode for Britain at the Montreal Olympics in 1976, the first royal to compete at that level, and 2 years earlier, a kidnap attempt failed on a London street. The decade closed with larger crowds, sharper lenses, and higher expectations. The family had grown in visibility and reach. The audience wanted more access and more story. Conditions that would soon collide with a fairy tale courtship and the pressures that followed. The decade opened with a broadcast fairy tale. In 1981, Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer before a global television audience counted in the hundreds of millions. The carriage processions, cathedral choirs, and balcony wave revived a sense that the crown could stage a national event with universal reach. Details fed the fascination. Designers stitched a gown with a 25-foot silk train, the longest in royal history, built to sweep the nave and the steps. Crowds lined streets for hours. Souvenir programs and commemorative mugs sold out. The institution found itself back at the center of shared cultural time. Diana's presence accelerated that pull. She was young, shy at first, then strikingly direct with people in crowds and hospital wards. Her manner cut through formality. She bent to speak with children at eye level, held hands without hesitation, and recognized faces from previous visits. Photographers caught expressions that read as unguarded, and those images circulated as fast as wires and printing presses allowed. The effect was immediate. Press interest swelled across continents, and the family's public schedule adjusted to handle demand that spilled beyond state events. The public story and the private strain soon diverged. The couple carried an age gap, different tastes, and uneven expectations about role and routine. Charles's long-standing attachment to Camilla Parker Bowles remained a factor, and palace efforts to keep personal dynamics off the front pages had limited reach. Staff tried to choreograph arrivals, seating, and split engagements. The headlines still followed tone and body language. Inside residences, advisors balanced compassion with protocol, aware that any misstep on either side could feed a hungry news cycle. Media dynamics shifted around Diana's appeal. Newspapers expanded royal desks. Picture agencies assigned teams to follow her movements across airports, clinics, and red carpets. The label People's Princess took hold as a shorthand for how she made formal engagements feel personal. That access reset boundaries. Paparazzi camped outside gyms and boutiques, and tabloid bidding wars pushed prices for exclusive shots and private stories upward. The palace could no longer rely on unwritten restraint. Editors weighed sales against discretion and often chose the former. Royal tours tested the hierarchy of attention. In Australia in 1983, crowds surged toward Diana, and walkabouts stretched as she stopped to greet as many people as possible. Coverage emphasized her rapport, smiles, quick conversations, and an ease with children, while Charles delivered speeches and met officials. The balance of focus shifted, not by decree, but by lens and audience response. Schedules that once placed the heir at the center now had to account where interest pooled on the ground. Her work began to change expectations of royal service. During the AIDS crisis, she visited patients in wards and hospices, and the act of shaking hands without gloves challenged fear and stigma. She lent support to campaigns that later evolved into high-profile work on landmines, signaling that patronage could mean advocacy in complex, sometimes political spaces. That approach broadened the scope of what a royal could do, while increasing scrutiny of motives and methods. By the early 1990s, internal pressures were visible. Princess Anne's marriage ended, and Prince Andrew's separation from Sarah Ferguson fed a stream of headlines. Tapes and transcripts, aggressively sourced and serialized, eroded the mystique that had once insulated the private sphere. The marriage that began with a record-setting train now moved towards separation in public view. The year 1992 would gather these threads, marital breakdowns, fire, and fatigue, into a turning point the Queen later marked with a phrase that still defines the period. She marked her 40th year on the throne by calling 1992 her Annus Horribilis, Latin for horrible year. The phrase fit because the royal brand, polished over decades, took blow after blow until its gloss looked like a costume. The public mood turned from curiosity to fatigue, then to open skepticism. Events that would once have stayed behind palace walls spilled into street chatter and front pages. By the year's end, the monarchy's reputation sat at a low not seen in living memory, and the institution began to feel less insulated from national judgment. The unraveling of 3 royal marriages made that judgment unavoidable. Charles and Diana's separation ended the hope that their union could be repaired in private. Their public roles continued, but their shared life did not, and the gap between ceremonial unity and personal distance became impossible to ignore. Andrew and Sarah, already bruised by headlines, also separated, with pictures and allegations driving the story rather than official statements. Anne's divorce from Mark Phillips closed a chapter begun in a different era. It was the first royal divorce since the 16th century, and it reset expectations about marriage inside the family. Then, flames reached the palace. In November, a fire tore through Windsor Castle, damaging more than 100 rooms and threatening irreplaceable works of art and craftsmanship. The sight of smoke above a fortress of continuity created an instant metaphor, but the argument that followed proved more damaging. Early signals that taxpayers might fund the restoration drew anger during a recession, and the palace faced a practical problem with political stakes. In response, the Queen took a step that changed how the crown handled money in public view. She voluntarily began paying income tax and opened parts of the palaces to visitors to help cover costs, an acknowledgement that ceremonial splendor needed a transparent ledger. Meanwhile, tabloid culture fed a constant cycle. Private arguments and recorded phone calls surfaced, and the Camillagate transcripts made personal feelings into mass entertainment. The border between public duty and private life collapsed, and the royal household found itself reacting to leaks rather than setting its own narrative. Radio segments, newspaper serializations, and late-night jokes kept the stories alive long after the formal announcements ended. Diana's approach magnified the shift. Through candid conversations and controlled media moments, she spoke directly to the public in a way the institution rarely did. Her visits, her touch, and her willingness to engage on issues considered sensitive at the time drew sympathy. The same impulse turned into criticism of palace rigidity. It wasn't rebellion so much as a different understanding of service, and it resonated far beyond Britain. That Latin phrase, minted in a formal speech, entered popular culture within hours. Newspapers plastered it across front pages in bold capitals. The classical term became a label for a year, then a shorthand for crisis, and finally, a cultural reference used well beyond royal reporting. The speed of that adoption showed how thoroughly 1992 had become a shared national story. The Queen held steady, adjusting protocols, widening access, and accepting modern scrutiny as part of the bargain. Reforms were quiet rather than theatrical, but they set a course. The family had endured the year, yet the most severe test still lay ahead. The sudden death of Diana would draw a sharper line between tradition and public expectation than anything 1992 produced, and the response would shape trust for a generation. August 31st, 1997, began with a headline no one expected to read. Princess Diana had died after a car crash in Paris. She was traveling with Dodi Fayed when their car entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, pursued by photographers, and struck a pillar. News moved from rumor to confirmation within hours, and the shock crossed borders and time zones. Television networks broke into programming. Radio stations turned somber. People who never followed royal news felt the loss immediately because Diana had functioned as more than a royal. She was a public figure whose warmth and visibility had created a personal bond with millions. The response took physical shape outside royal residences. In London, gates vanished behind flowers, photos, teddy bears, and handwritten notes. Kensington Palace became the center, but Buckingham Palace drew crowds too, forming the largest spontaneous public memorial in modern British history. Florists ran out of stock. Municipal crews cleared walkways and returned hours later to find them covered again. The scent of cut flowers mixed with the scrape of cellophane and the low murmur of strangers telling stories about a woman they never met. The scale told its own story. The country was grieving in public, and it expected the crown to do the same. The royal family stayed at Balmoral with William and Harry, protecting the boys from cameras and noise. That silence, intended as care, read differently outside the castle walls. Commentators questioned the absence of flags at half-mast, the lack of statements, and the sense that the institution stood apart from the national mood. Newspapers ran editorials, call-in shows filled with anger. The gap between private mourning and public expectation looked like indifference, and the criticism grew. This became the monarchy's hardest communications test. The audience no longer accepted ritual alone. It wanted feeling expressed in clear, human terms. Advisors weighed against precedent against the current moment and found that precedent could not lead. The palace adjusted course. When the Queen returned to London, she walked the line of flowers, read the cards, and paused with members of the crowd. The live broadcast that followed, framed by the words, "As your Queen and as a grandmother," connected constitutional duty to family care, and the temperature of the city shifted. Diana's funeral at Westminster Abbey turned into a global broadcast. Estimates put the audience above 2.5 billion. The streets of London formed a quiet corridor for the cortege, and Earl Spencer's eulogy framed her life as service shaped by pressure, with a pointed warning about media intrusion. The music, the hymns, and the silence between them stretched across continents in real time, uniting people who had only known her through screens and headlines. One detail captured the cultural wave that followed. Elton John reworked Candle in the Wind as a tribute to Diana, and the single became the best-selling in history. The numbers reflected more than a song's success. They measured the reach of her story and the desire to hold on to it. Her death altered the monarchy's operating norms. Public engagements took on a warmer tone. Communication grew faster, more direct, and more responsive to sentiment. The image softened without abandoning formality. For William and Harry, aged 15 and 12, the walk behind their mother's coffin left an imprint that shaped how they later approached public life, charity, and the press. Diana's loss marked a turning point for the crown, forcing a new balance with media and a closer alignment with the emotional expectations of the people who watched, judged, and, in that week, grieved together. The week after Diana's death reset expectations. The monarchy needed to show presence, speak faster, and meet the public where it stood. The next years turned into a methodical repair job, not a rebrand in slogans, but a rebalancing of tone, access, and service. Court circulars still recorded engagements, but the mood shifted. Walkabouts lasted longer, conversations grew less scripted, and charitable visits centered on people rather than pageantry. The institution moved carefully, but it moved. Queen Elizabeth II calibrated her style. The set-piece ceremonies stayed, yet her speeches leaned more on shared experiences and common purpose. Appearances at hospitals, youth centers, and local commemorations carried a warmer cadence. She allowed more visibility into the working machinery of the crown, clearer briefings, quicker statements after national events, and schedules that placed her in spaces where empathy, not grandeur, did the work. The goal was simple: be seen, be understood, be useful. Communication modernized. The palace increased access for broadcasters, adopted faster press responses, and widened photography from set poses to working moments. Public engagements became more approachable, fewer stiff receiving lines, more direct conversations, Royal households coordinated messaging to avoid mixed signals, and digital tools began edging into daily practice, trialed in small ways before becoming routine. For Prince Charles, the period served as a long path to rehabilitation. He leaned into substance, environmental stewardship, sustainable agriculture, and urban design. His projects, from organic farming to community-centered planning, were explained through site visits, roundtables, and regular reports. The Prince's Trust expanded its profile by showcasing outcomes rather than prestige. The work did not erase old narratives, but it reframed him as an heir invested in practical solutions and measurable results. Camilla Parker Bowles returned to public life quietly. Early appearances were low-key and linked to Charles's causes. Over time, familiarity reduced friction. The focus on steady service, small-scale events, and careful introductions built acceptance. By the time of their civil marriage in 2005, the union felt less like an argument and more like a conclusion reached step by step. William and Harry, now teenagers becoming adults, learned public roles under closer scrutiny than any generation before them. They balanced school, military training, and early charitable work, often in areas tied to their mother's interests: homelessness, mental health, landmine clearance, tempered by their grandmother's emphasis on duty and discipline. Their appearances were deliberate rather than frequent, designed to build experience without turning them into constant fixtures. The year 2002 concentrated both loss and unity. The Queen marked her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne, with nationwide events that strengthened a sense of continuity. In the same year, the deaths of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret drew the country into mourning and remembrance, reinforcing the Crown's role at national milestones. During the Jubilee, the Queen traveled over 40,000 miles across the UK and Commonwealth, more distance than she covered during her first decade as monarch. The scale underscored commitment, not spectacle. Across these years, credibility returned quietly. Public expectations shifted from glamour to reliability, and the Windsors answered with steadiness, transparency, and a clear focus on service. Engagements emphasized outcomes. Finances and access were explained rather than assumed. By the time Charles and Camilla formalized their partnership, the institution had regained balance. The digital age pressed in, and the palace responded with quicker statements, broader outreach, and a tone that felt closer to everyday life. Scandal, grief, and scrutiny had not disappeared, but the Crown looked more adaptable and more resilient, ready for the next round of change. The Windsors stepped into the late 2000s with a new toolkit. Websites, 24-hour news, and early social platforms reshaped how the palace spoke to the public. The family had weathered its worst years and found a steadier voice. Now the challenge was keeping that voice audible in a digital crowd. Press offices moved quicker. Engagements were framed with clearer context. Behind-the-scenes footage and tightly edited clips began to appear, making royal work easier to follow in short, shareable bursts. The aim was straightforward: clarity over mystique, rhythm over spectacle. That shift arrived amid a cautious optimism. Scandal fatigue erased, and the Windsors looked more coordinated. Public walkabouts, charity visits, and military ceremonies leaned into consistency. The institution embraced a gentler tone without abandoning formality. You could sense the calibration in travel schedules, joint engagements, and the way household teams aligned messages. The monarchy began to look less like a brittle relic and more like a functioning brand of service calibrated for a media-saturated world. William and Henry became the bridge to younger audiences. Both trained and served in uniform, giving them credibility beyond titles. They threw their weight behind causes they had studied, not just visited: homelessness, youth opportunity, veterans' recovery, and mental health. Their military roles carried real risk and long hours, and their charity work came with measurable targets and annual reports. The combination made them feel legible to people their age, a mix of duty, structure, and an accessible speaking style that translated well on television and in classrooms. William's relationship with Kate Middleton had its own timeline, quieter than any royal romance of the prior generation. They met at St. Andrews, navigated student life, and managed years of attention while setting boundaries. Their appearances together stayed low-key: family events, discreet holidays, and occasional public moments that read as ordinary. The appeal sat in that normality, the sense that this was a partnership built before a press plan. Harry's deployment to Afghanistan during 2007 and 2008 marked a notable milestone. He became the first royal in a combat zone since the Falklands era, serving under strict protocols and with an agreement that kept his presence quiet until after the fact. When it became public, the response focused on service rather than glamour. The experience strengthened his connection to veterans and shaped the projects he would back in the years ahead. Meanwhile, Charles and Camilla settled into a rhythm that felt stable. Their joint diary filled with regional visits, literacy initiatives, and rural economy projects. The couple's comfort in public settings, schools, markets, heritage sites, built a picture of steady partnership. Acceptance grew not from a single grand gesture, but from repetition and visible results linked to their work. Digital modernization reached the sovereign's desk. The royal website served as a central hub for speeches, diaries, and educational material. It standardized information and cut down on rumor. The move looked modern, but it tracked with a long pattern of quiet adaptation. Decades earlier, in 1976, Elizabeth had sent her first email from a military base, making her one of the earliest heads of state to use electronic mail. Documentaries, official YouTube channels, and live broadcasts widened access. Edited features showed how engagements unfolded, while event streams pulled in global viewers. With that came new scrutiny, but also a wider base of goodwill. The stage was set for a public ready to celebrate big moments, romance, weddings, and a new generation stepping forward under brighter lights. The comeback began with a wedding. In April 2011, Prince William married Catherine Middleton at Westminster Abbey, and global attention locked in. The ceremony mixed ancient ritual with a modern couple who looked comfortable in both lanes. Broadcasters syndicated feeds across continents, and more than 2 billion people tuned in. What viewers saw was a family projecting continuity through a pair who felt relatable, no royal mystique required. The Abbey's setting gave it weight. The tone gave it reach. Kate's background mattered. She arrived without aristocratic lineage, a graduate with a working family and a long relationship built away from palaces. That fact read as quiet reform. The match suggested the institution valued commitment and stability over pedigree. It also hinted at a crown that had learned from past spectacles. Less fairy tale, more partnership with a clear plan for public life. Her early engagements focused on early childhood, mental health, and sport, themes with practical outcomes and wide public interest. Their first tours showed the model. North America welcomed them with street walkabouts and veterans events. Canada's celebrations blended ceremony with outdoor festivals. In Asia and Oceania, school visits, disaster recovery sites, and indigenous cultural meetings replaced set-piece banquets as the central images. The clothes and staged photographs still existed, but the clips that circulated were handshakes, brief conversations, and unscripted smiles. Soft diplomacy looked like listening and steady schedules rather than grand speeches. William kept a measured profile, direct, careful, a professional in uniform and in public. Harry cut through crowds with quick humor and easy movement, turning formal lines into conversations. The contrasts worked. Younger audiences who watched short clips or scrolled headlines got two paths into the same institution. One through consistency, one through spark. Both supported a message that royal service could look current without abandoning discipline. The same year brought a national milestone. The Diamond Jubilee in 2012 marked 6 decades of Elizabeth II's reign, and it played out as a map of public gratitude. River pageants, street parties, and a packed service at St. Paul's framed a sovereign who had remained constant through political and cultural change. That constancy earned fresh relevance rather than nostalgia. During those celebrations, she also stood as the most widely traveled monarch in history, with visits to 116 countries, all without holding a passport, an oddity that underlined the unique mechanics of constitutional monarchy. London hosted the Olympics weeks later, and the opening ceremony delivered a playful jolt. A filmed sequence placed the Queen alongside James Bond before a stunt double descended by parachute toward the stadium. The moment signaled a willingness to engage popular culture on its own terms. It read as self-aware, light, and sharp, a contrast to the formality that had defined earlier decades. Meanwhile, Prince Charles expanded a portfolio that now looked like preparation for future leadership. His environmental work moved from advocacy to implementation. Sustainable farming through duchy projects, traditional craft training and urban regeneration, and convening faith leaders to lower cultural temperature around sensitive issues. The program was granular: reports, pilot sites, and partnerships that tied principles to measurable outcomes. It strengthened his standing without asking for applause. By the middle of the decade, the Windsors enjoyed a broad base of goodwill. Glamour returned, but duty sat in the foreground. Global visibility seemed routine again. Yet the same media force that amplified popularity could magnify strain, and the next years would press hard on that balance. By 2017, the Windsors stood at peak visibility. Jubilees behind them, new heirs in front, and global audiences tuned in through phones more than television. The institution looked stable on the surface, yet the pace of change inside and outside the palace was accelerating. Generational handovers shifted work from elder royals to younger teams. Social media brought immediate reaction to every engagement, gesture, and rumor. Public warmth remained high, but the margins for error narrowed, and private disagreements moved faster into public view. The following year delivered a landmark. Prince Harry married Meghan Markle at Windsor Castle in 2018, and the ceremony signaled a monarchy attempting to reflect the country it served. Meghan arrived as a mixed-race American actress with a self-built career, established philanthropy, and media experience. The event blended royal ritual with a wider cultural vocabulary, diverse clergy, gospel music, and a global guest list, showing how tradition could stretch to meet a broader audience without losing form. The coverage reached well beyond royal watchers and into millions who normally ignored palace news. Her arrival drew intense focus. Enthusiasm met suspicion. Praise sat beside attack headlines. Interest in clothes, speeches, and causes crashed into a market that rewarded provocation. The volume amplified every decision: private staffing choices, family dynamics, and scheduling, with scrutiny that moved at the speed of the feed. Questions about representation and belonging surfaced quickly, and the monarchy found itself at the center of debates about identity in a changing Britain. Press practices sharpened the edges. Aggressive pursuit of stories, the resale of paparazzi images, and commentary that leaned on racially coded descriptions reignited long-standing arguments about class, privilege, and who gets to define British in public life. Legal letters and right-of-reply statements became routine. At the same time, supporters used new platforms to document bias, archive headlines, and counter narratives in real time. The battlefield was not evening news, it was the timeline. Inside the family, different models of royal work came into friction. A modern, direct-to-audience approach, curated social posts, guest-edited magazines, tightly controlled interviews, ran against an older system that preferred slow consensus and private course correction. Coordination between households strained. Attempts to build separate offices and distinct brands highlighted the line between innovation and insubordination. The result was drift, then open separation. By early 2020, Harry and Meghan announced they would step back from senior roles, seek financial independence, and base themselves in North America. The move, branded Megxit by the press, forced rapid negotiations over security, titles, and funding. It also tested the Crown's ability to flex without fracturing. The settlement allowed them to pursue commercial projects while ceasing to represent the sovereign officially, an arrangement that acknowledged both personal autonomy and institutional boundaries. This period carried a separate shock. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein led to intense scrutiny of his judgment and friendships. A disastrous television interview accelerated public backlash and prompted his withdrawal from public duties. The damage extended beyond one individual. It raised questions about access, accountability, and the vetting of royal relationships. Through these storms, the Queen held to method: brief statements, carefully staged appearances, and business-as-usual schedules that projected steadiness. Meanwhile, the information landscape flipped. In 2019, for the first time, more people followed the royals on Instagram than through traditional newspapers, a clear sign that the front page had moved to the feed. By 2020, the family stood in a new era of scrutiny and reinvention, with momentum building toward loss, legacy, and a transition that would test every adaptation they had made. The final years of Elizabeth II's reign opened in a world that looked different from the one she had shaped for decades. Britain navigated constitutional debates, a reworked place in Europe, and a pandemic that reordered daily life. Through it, she held to routine, red boxes, weekly audiences, and a timetable that signaled continuity. The public read steadiness from that rhythm. The Crown's message was simple: duty continues even when the ground shifts. April 2021 broke that rhythm. Prince Philip died at 99, ending a partnership that had anchored her from the war years onward. The union had defined royal work as a two-person craft, the sovereign in front, the consort building the frame behind. Tributes reviewed a life of service that stretched from the Mediterranean Fleet to Prince Philip's awards programs and thousands of engagements. For the Queen, the loss was personal and logistical. The man who had handled the blunt questions and private candor was gone, and the workload of presence rested solely on her. The funeral presented an image that traveled far beyond the chapel. Under COVID-19 rules, the Queen sat alone in St. George's Chapel, masked and distant, while the choir and small congregation kept format but not scale. That scene became an emblem of the era, individual grief set within national restriction. It also underscored how closely the monarch's life tracked with public experience. From wartime broadcasts to pandemic guidelines followed without exception. Even through lockdowns, she continued to work. Televised addresses delivered calm instruction and reassurance, most notably the "We will meet again" message, which echoed the language of endurance heard in earlier crises. Virtual audiences replaced crowded rooms. Investitures paused, then returned in modified form. The emphasis stayed on presence, sometimes a screen, sometimes at a distance engagement, always with an eye to rules that applied to everyone else. Pressure mounted from other directions. A high-profile interview by Prince Harry and Meghan in 2021 launched a global conversation about the institution's culture, race, and accountability. It reopened questions that had simmered for years and forced the palace into carefully worded responses and internal reflection. The episode showed how global media could reframe domestic institutions in a single broadcast. Amid strain, 2022 brought an unmatched milestone. The Platinum Jubilee marked 70 years on the throne, the first time a British monarch had reached that length of service. Celebrations stretched from local street gatherings to national events, and the focus rested on longevity as a public good, stability built day by day. A brief, light moment with Paddington Bear during the festivities landed with unusual force. It compressed decades of public familiarity into a few seconds, softening formality without discarding it. Her reach, measured across time rather than platforms, carried a striking statistic. Over her reign, she met 15 British prime ministers and 14 U.S. presidents, from Churchill to Biden. That continuity placed her near the center of post-war public life, not as a politician, but as an experienced witness to political cycles. Later that year, her health declined. Mobility issues shortened appearances and moved engagements closer to home. The transition that had been quietly prepared for years accelerated. On September 8, 2022, she died at Balmoral Castle. The response unfolded across borders. flowers outside palaces, church bells across the Commonwealth, queues that stretched for miles, and silence during processions that linked castles, cathedrals, and city streets. The public said goodbye to a figure whose steadiness had defined expectations of service. The nation then turned toward a new reign, carrying habits and lessons formed under a monarch whose presence had spanned generations. The handover came with ritual and restraint. After Elizabeth II's death in 2022, accession councils met, proclamations sounded across the nations, and Charles became King Charles III. The moment carried the weight of a long apprenticeship ending at last. He had been the longest-serving heir in British history, shaped by decades of preparation that stretched from investitures to international forums. The transition felt both seamless and heavy, a familiar face stepping into a role that demanded continuity while nodding toward change. Continuity showed in the daily machinery: red boxes, audiences, and a diary that filled quickly with visits across the UK and Commonwealth. Change appeared in priorities that had defined Charles's public life long before the crown. He had campaigned for environmental responsibility when it sounded fringe, funded research and pilot farms focused on sustainable methods, and pushed for architecture that served communities rather than fashion. He convened faith leaders not as a one-off photo call, but as a repeating practice meant to lower social temperature and encourage shared ground. Urban renewal projects under his charities mapped these ideas onto real streets, training craftspeople and restoring derelict spaces. Camilla's new status told a parallel story. Crowned Queen Consort, she represented a reconciliation journey carried out over years. What began as controversy ended in a working partnership built on routine service, literacy programs, domestic abuse awareness, and regular regional visits. The arc reflected a wider social shift in how personal histories are read against present conduct, and how sustained service can rebuild standing. The coronation in 2023 underlined this balance. Ancient regalia and oaths framed the rite, but the staging widened the lens. A broader guest list, a mix of musical traditions, and a tighter runtime signaled an institution aware of the public mood. Environmental symbolism threaded through the choices of materials and messaging, aligning ceremony with a theme Charles had advanced for decades. The event aimed to project continuity without grandeur for its own sake. With the new reign came a recalibration of roles for the next generation. William and Catherine became Prince and Princess of Wales, taking on higher-profile duties that focus on early childhood, mental health, and community resilience. Their schedule moved from set pieces to program-led work, pilot initiatives, multi-year partnerships, and measurable outcomes designed to show impact rather than produce a single headline. The approach positioned them as the stable hinge between tradition and future leadership. Distance defined another branch. Harry and Meghan remained outside royal duties, building media and philanthropic ventures on their own timetable. The publication of a memoir in 2023 sharpened divisions in public debate and within the family's private space. The monarchy's response stayed procedural: limited comment, clear lines about representation, and an emphasis on the diary of work. Charles brought his long-standing advocacy into the diplomatic sphere. He became the first British monarch to address a UN climate summit, a continuation of his decades of environmental work that now matched mainstream policy debates. That role extends beyond speeches to convening, gatherings that link investors, scientists, farmers, and city leaders around shared targets. The road ahead carries scrutiny, economic strain, constitutional questions across the nations, and a media environment that rewards conflict raise the bar for relevance. Yet the crown still provides symbolic unity through routine, investitures, national services, and the unglamorous cadence of regional visits. The Windsors face the familiar test of their century: adapt without losing shape, serve without spectacle, and keep the monarchy legible to a public that measures value in outcomes, not pageantry. The House of Windsor wasn't born, it was chosen under pressure, proof that symbols can save a crown when actions earn their weight. History rewrites itself through names, titles, and rituals that shift with power. Subscribe to explore how royal image, myth, and survival still shape the world we live in.